1918, the guns finally stopped firing across Europe, but the deafening trauma, that remains. France had won the First World War, yet the victory felt practically indistinguishable from absolute annihilation. The trenches were soaked in blood, vast stretches of the Northeast were reduced to literal cratered moonscapes, and the leaders of France were staring down a future they were absolutely terrified they couldn't survive. It was this profound existential fear that birthed the most misunderstood fortification in human history. 1,500,000. That is not just some cold, stark statistic you gloss over in a history book. That is an entire generation of young French men completely erased in the unspeakable carnage of modern warfare. This trauma fundamentally shattered and rewired the French national psyche. The absolute, undeniable mandate of the post-war era was simple. This level of slaughter could never, ever happen on French soil again. Now pair that trauma with a terrifying demographic reality. France's population was much smaller, and it was growing far slower than their old enemy just across the Rhine. The mathematics of survival here were brutally simple. They quite literally did not have the young men to feed into the meat grinder of open battle a second time. Okay, let's dive into this. War Minister André Maginot, who was actually a highly decorated veteran, severely wounded in those exact same trenches, championed a profoundly logical conclusion. If France couldn't match German manpower soldier for soldier, they would substitute concrete and steel for flesh and blood. They would build defenses so impossibly formidable that any invading army would just completely shatter against them. But to really understand what they built, we have to completely throw out the popular myth. It wasn't just a wall. Prepare for a massive perspective shift here. We are looking at a multi-billion-dollar network constructed meticulously throughout the 1930s. The largest of these fortresses, the ouvrages, weren't mere concrete pillboxes. They were genuine, sprawling underground cities of war. And this brilliantly illustrates the reality. 90% of this colossal infrastructure was completely buried. The architects designed it this way intentionally. The whole idea was to completely escape the devastating artillery bombardments that had wiped out so many men just a decade prior. We're talking about subterranean metropolises stretching for kilometers beneath the earth. Garrisons of hundreds, sometimes thousands of soldiers lived, ate, and worked entirely underground for months at a time. They used electric underground railways to move heavy munitions. They had fully equipped surgical hospitals, advanced air filtration systems designed specifically to block poison gas, and completely self-sufficient food and water stores. Up on the surface, the visible footprint was almost non-existent. You'd barely know it was there. Just these incredibly heavy armored steel cupolas that would mechanically retract, popping up from the ground just long enough to fire their heavy cannons and machine guns, and then smoothly sinking right back down into impenetrable reinforced concrete. By literally every known measure of engineering at the time, this line was genuinely impregnable. So, here's the big question. Looking at all this invulnerability, why on earth did they deliberately leave a massive, completely undefended gap in it? Because the Maginot Line didn't cover the entire French border. Up at the north, it just stopped. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that this gap was absolutely not some foolish oversight. It was a highly calculated entanglement of military, financial, and political choices. Politically, extending the wall meant walling off their ally, Belgium, essentially abandoning them. Geographically, the gap fell right around the densely wooded Ardennes region, which the High Command firmly believed was a natural barrier, totally impassable to a modern mechanized army. Because here is the shocking truth, and it totally changes how we view this history. The wall was a deliberate, colossal trap. It was actually never meant to stop the Germans all by itself. It was engineered to make a direct attack into eastern France so horrifically costly that the Germans would be forced to maneuver around it, funneling them directly into the open plains of Belgium, which, by the way, is exactly where the French and British armies were heavily massed, waiting, and fully prepared to fight on open ground. Honestly, the French strategy was completely coherent based on the hard-won experience of the past, but that coherence met a catastrophic reality. The French expected a massive infantry sweep through those open plains. The Germans, though, they understood the trap perfectly. Instead of falling into it, they built an entirely revolutionary, fast-moving armored doctrine, Blitzkrieg, specifically designed to bypass it altogether. Let's move to and see how this builds, because the momentum in May 1940 was terrifyingly swift. German panzer divisions didn't go through the plains. Supported by aircraft, they threaded their tanks right through those narrow, impassable, wooded hills of the Ardennes with astonishing speed. They crossed the Meuse River at Sedan, burst into the open country, and raced straight for the English Channel, slicing the Allied armies right in two. 6 weeks. That's it. In exactly 6 weeks, the mighty nation of France completely fell. So the crucial point is this breathtaking, tragic irony. The magnificent fortresses of the Maginot Line actually worked. They stood entirely unbeaten. Not a single main fortress was breached by direct assault. But their heavy guns were permanently pointing east, staring down a quiet border, while the enemy poured relentlessly through their undefended flank in the west. Think about that. Most of those underground garrisons remained completely safe, secure, and defiant inside their concrete tombs, as their country literally burned behind them. They never lost a battle. They only surrendered because the French government capitulated and explicitly ordered them to lay down their arms. They emerged from the earth entirely unbeaten, but utterly, devastatingly irrelevant. Which leaves us with this incredibly haunting question. What happens to a perfect defense against a war that never comes? You invest billions, you engineer absolute miracles, you prepare meticulously to prevent the blood-soaked trauma of the past from ever repeating itself, and the future simply goes around you. Today, those monumental, undefeated, subterranean cities still sit sealed beneath the French countryside. A few are museums, sure, but most are just abandoned concrete tombs out in the woods, slowly, silently surrendering to the damp and the rust and the dark.